Alright, so this is the first presentation in Unit 4, and in this one we're just looking at the physical geography of Latin America. So landforms, and then some about the climate, and then human-environment interaction. So first off, Latin America includes everything from Mexico down to the very southern tip of South America, which is called Tierra del Fuego. And of course the Caribbean Sea as well, and all the islands in there. So first off, climate. The climate in Latin America varies greatly because of the distance that it expands north and south of the equator. And so because of that, you're going to see obviously a lot of variation in climate. So as an example, in Argentina, you can go snow skiing in the Andes Mountains. And then of course you have the Amazonian rainforest along the equator. But there's also drastic changes in elevation. So you could be along the equator, but high in elevation like on Ecuador, and still have cold temperatures. And so there's a lot of places in Latin America where the temperature may not exceed 70 or 75 degrees as a high temperature just because of the elevation they are at. And then, of course, the currents from the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So the Atlantic side is a warm ocean current, and the Pacific side is a cold current. So again, along the coast, even near the equator, you'll have a cooler climate due to the cooler current coming from the Pacific Ocean. And then we also mentioned the ITCZ zone, also known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone. This is right along the equator, where you see this band of clouds on this photo of the Earth. And this area, one of the main terms we use for it is called the doldrums. And basically, there's not a lot of wind movement that occurs in this part of the Earth. Therefore, we see a lot of evaporation from the ocean because of the intense heat hitting the ocean. So you see a lot of convection occurring here, which creates these very large thunderstorms. So it's a part of the Earth where we see some of the most powerful thunderstorms. Also not a place where you want to get stuck sailing because there's just not really any wind to push you forward. All right, then El Nino versus La Nina. So these two weather patterns have a huge effect on what is happening in the world. So El Nino, during an El Nino year, this means the water off the coast, west coast of South America, is warmer than normal. And this causes North and South America to be warmer and wetter than usual. And then Asia and the Pacifica region, which is like Australia, New Zealand, and all the islands there, tend to be drier and cooler. And during a La Nina year, it's the opposite. So here it's dry and cool, and then in Asia, it's warm and wet. And those fluctuate every 3 to 7 years or so. And that's the water in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of South America. Then your mountain ranges, you have two main mountain ranges, the Andes Mountains, which are the second highest mountain range in the world. It's the longest mountain range in the world. It's like a spinal cord going down the west coast of South America. It goes from Chile to Panama. Then you have the Sierra Madres in Mexico. And there's two sides to those, so they're kind of split in half with a valley in between. So you have Oriental and Occidental. And like I said, in the middle is generally flatter, and then they converge as you get down towards the Yucatan Peninsula. All right, and then here's just some photos. Here you can see the Andes Mountains. There's the Andes in Chile. There's the Andes in Argentina. And then, of course, Machu Picchu is in the Andes Mountains as well. And so just kind of go through these photos real quick and then get on down to the Amazon River Basin. So this is a huge physical feature, obviously, in South America. It takes up a huge part of the continent. And the Amazon River itself is the largest river system in the world. It has over 1,000 tributaries that feed this river. So remember, tributary is kind of like a branch on a tree. The trunk is the main river, and the branches are what feed into the trunk. So there's a lot flowing into the Amazon. The drainage basin of the Amazon, so all the water that flows into the Amazon out to the Atlantic Ocean, that is the size of the United States of America. So it's a huge area of water flowing out of South America. It's also the second longest river in the world. Of course, the Nile is longer, but the Amazon pumps out about 60 times more water than the Nile River does, of course, because the Nile goes to the Sahara Desert. And so as you can see here, the Amazon going through the forest here, it's a very thick forest, and so there are still tribes in the Amazon that haven't been reached by modern humans to this point because of how thick that forest is. All right, so a couple of facts about it. Of course, rainforest covers more than just the Amazon region. It also goes into Central America as well, and even some of the islands in the Caribbean. But they're mainly, of course, near the equator. The Amazonian rainforest, though, covers about 2 million acres, but it is shrinking fast due to some issues that we'll talk about later. And then, generally speaking, you have a tropical climate zone throughout most of Latin America. So that's Everything in between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn is considered the tropics. So a huge portion of Latin America falls in that range. And then, of course, in the rainforest, you see a lot of different ecosystems where, plants and animals and other organisms depend upon each other for survival. And you should have already learned, what that is before in biology and, of course, in middle school. And then biodiversity. So in the rainforest, is the most biodiverse area in the world. Around 85% of all life on Earth is in the rainforest. So looking at insects, animal life, and all of that, plants, it's a huge amount that's there. And then the term that we use for the Amazon is the lungs of the planet. So basically, the amount of oxygen that the rainforest produces, and not just that, but the amount of air that just cleanses for the whole Earth is incredible. So it's literally like the lungs of the planet. They're vastly important to our survival. And then the grasslands. So to the north of the rainforest and also to the south, you have two major grasslands in South America. You have the Pampas in Argentina and the Llanos in Venezuela. And both are used for grazing and farming. So Argentina is really well known for their steak, their cattle production there from that. And so that's going to bring in some money for both countries. And then we'll skip on down past some of these photos and go to your desert. So the main desert in this region is the Atacama Desert. This is the driest desert on Earth. And portions of this desert have gone more than 400 years without rain. And so it's incredibly dry. And actually part of this desert is where we've used to train for missions on Mars, such as the rover mission and also the idea of having like a manned mission on Mars. The training goes on in the Atacama. And as far as why it's there, remember what rain shadow is. So the Andes Mountains block all the moisture coming from the Pacific Ocean, and it can't make it over the Andes, and therefore creates this really dry area. So there again is the photo of the Atacama. You can see just how it is looks similar to Mars in its landscape. All right, then moving on down to the Caribbean. So we got a series of archipelagos. So remember, an archipelago is a chain of islands, and so we have three main chain of islands in the Caribbean. You have the Greater Antilles, which is like Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola. Remember, on Hispaniola is where we have Haiti and Dominican Republic. You do need to know those for the map quiz coming up. Then the Lesser Antilles is your smaller islands that are on the border, pretty much border of the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. Now, these you don't need to know for the map quiz. I'm not going to ask you about like St. Kitts and St. Lucia and stuff like that. Then the Bahamas, which is, of course, the island group off the coast of Florida and north of Cuba, that is up there. So that's your three main archipelagos. So there's Bahamas from space. And we'll skip down those photos and go on down to human and environment interaction. So in South America, especially along the Andes, the Incan Indians had to adapt to their environment in order to survive there. And since you don't have a lot of flat land to be able to farm on, they had to resort to terrace farming or terracing. So as you can see in this photo, they cut into the sides of the mountain and create terraces to be able to farm on because they have a lack of arable land, and so that's how they survive there. Now, of course, because of the mountains, they weren't able to have a large civilization, so you're not going to see a large population living there. And also, too, just the land doesn't produce enough natural resources in order to support a large population there either. All right, and then also in the rainforest, we see some destruction on the rainforest due to natives that live there. One of the main types of farming they take part in is called slash and burn farming. So this is where they cut down portions of the rainforest and then they burn it. Part of the burning is for clearing, but also that puts nutrients into the soil so they can farm on it. And so this is mainly indigenous people that are doing this, that are practicing slash and burn. But the problem is this is causing deforestation, and this is really the problem that a lot of countries that have the rainforest have to deal with, is how do you conserve the rainforest and conserve animal life, but at the same time allow your indigenous people to continue living the way they've been living for thousands of years. And so creating that balance between the two, because obviously the indigenous people in these countries don't realize the kind of impact that they're having on the rest of the world, or how much we rely on the rainforest even here, because they obviously don't know that much about the world outside of where they live. So it's hard to obviously be able to educate them on that and the impact they're having. All right, and then more about HEI. So we also have a lot of people moving to cities. So we got some huge cities in Latin America, like Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires. These cities attract huge amounts of people moving in because you have a lot of poor people from the countryside looking for better jobs. So the pull factors coming into the city are going to be better jobs, better education, hopefully better living conditions, things of that sort. And obviously the push factors pushing them out of the countryside is all the negative things, the lack of opportunity, the lack of education for their children. But when they come into these cities, especially in mass numbers, and they're not very well educated, there's not that many opportunities for them. They're all vying for the same level jobs, your lower level jobs, and there's only so many of those available. And so then if they don't have a job and they don't have a place they can live, they end up living in the slums of the barrios that surround these cities, and they end up turning to crime because there is no other option for them. And so then it just creates this cycle of poverty that we see in a lot of these cities. And of course, they need more infrastructure. That's one of the big problems in these cities is there's not enough infrastructure to provide for these places, especially as these barrios, as they develop around the cities. You can't get good roads in there. You can't get electricity, running water. Crime is going to be rampant because police can't really get in there. And stuff like that. And so this is just a huge problem in Latin America. And if we refer back to when we talked about population, and I showed you, how many people are moving to some of these cities per hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's just so much stress on these cities. They can't possibly keep up. There's no way to plan for the amount of growth they're seeing because of this. And so it just creates a lot of issues. All right, and then last thing on here, looking at tourism. So tourism, of course, is big in the Caribbean and parts of Mexico and stuff like that. And there's pros and cons to this, and of course you need to be able to argue both sides. And so the good side is that it creates new jobs. Think about all that is created when tourism comes in. Obviously you have hotels that are created, but then you have restaurants, car rentals, different tours like swim with dolphins and snorkeling and hiking, ATV tours, horseback riding, all kinds of things are going to be created because of that. So that's good. You get new jobs, which also reduces the income gap between rich and poor within the country. But some of the negatives is you're going to see habitats ruined for the animals that live around there, especially if you're near the rainforest. You're going to increase pollution, definitely. Debt actually gets increased, and this happens because the countries invest a lot to create these spaces for tourists. But most of the money flows out of the country because usually these resorts are owned by American or European companies, and therefore the money doesn't stay in the country and get invested back into the country. And then it creates this obvious gap between the rich and poor among the tourists and the locals, and it can create animosity and some hatred there, and can also cause tourists to be a target of crime and to be pickpocketed or worse, mugged and something like that. Because of that jealousy that's created there from seeing that gap between the rich and poor, between the tourists and the locals. And then, like I was saying, the owners of these resorts are usually foreign owners, and so the profits, the big money, doesn't stay in these countries to really help them. It flows out, whereas in your locals are just doing your lower level jobs at these hotels and restaurants and things of that sort.